So, just in terms of a context of that, I think I can project if I wander. So, you would have already heard back at your school communities that we're rolling out a liberal arts approach throughout our secondary curriculum. And I suppose that can appear a little daunting, particularly if you haven't been exposed yet to philosophy style and liberal arts style approaches and studies in Catholic thought as yet. But what it really means is finding examples of the liberal arts where it's relevant and appropriate, and to use those throughout the curriculum to try and help the teaching and learning in religious education. And we'll get to more of that shortly. It really is planned in a strategic way, this liberal arts approach. So in the Sydney Catholic School Strategic Improvement Plan, it has its own item, as you can see here. This is a screen capture of that. I'm not expecting you to read all of that at all, but the outcome is to integrate the Catholic liberal arts and philosophy into years 5 to 10 of the religious education curriculum. We are not turning it into studies in Catholic thought in the junior years. That's not it at all. We're relevant and appropriate examples of the Catholic liberal arts and some philosophy-style teaching and learning strategies, the pedagogy, where it's appropriate and relevant for that particular learning intention. So why are you here today? Staff will be trained in the Catholic liberal arts so that we can empower you to go back to your schools and look at your teaching and learning programs and start to integrate some of these ideas that you've learned today and some of the pedagogy that also will be presented to you by Peter shortly. As a team, as a secondary religious education team, we're also updating the support documents that you will find on the curriculum website. And if your RECs have been shown that website, but instead of having multiple documents everywhere, that's all being brought together into a curriculum website. So we're updating that progressively after each one of these days so that there are some examples in the support documents ready to help schools if need be. But the idea would be that when you return to your school communities, and you will have an opportunity to start this afternoon, you will start to integrate some of those liberal arts resources and pedagogical approaches into your programs. You'll start that today. It doesn't have to be in every single experience. We're relevant and appropriate. A bit like marrying perspectives, the Eucharist and Eucharistic living, etc. And onto those religious education priorities now. That's a nice segue. Important components of our tradition. So as you know, there's 6 of them. And they weave their way throughout each one of our teaching and learning programs. I've mentioned a few already. There's marrying perspectives, Eucharist and Eucharistic living, tradition, etc. We've added a new priority called the liberal arts. And you will find that in the revised curriculum website as well. We'll have a look at that shortly when I bring up the screen. So effectively that means the curriculum is saying you have to have the Catholic liberal arts somewhere. Examples where it is relevant and appropriate. It's up to you as a school where they appear, how often they appear, where you consider it relevant and appropriate, connecting with that particular concept that the students are learning and exploring in the religious education classroom. I think this is important. So as long as they help to allow the students to understand the faith and enrich their learning experience. So don't try and manufacture and strain yourself to go, I have to have a liberal arts thing. If it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. But gee, there's a lot of areas where the rich tradition of our church, the Catholic liberal arts and philosophical inquiry does fit beautifully. And we'll get to that throughout this morning's sessions. And they're the priorities that I was talking about. So Marian perspectives, Eucharist and Eucharistic living, prayer, liturgy, liturgical year, church teaching, scripture, and you can see that we've added the liberal arts as a final one. And for most of you, your teaching programs will have little icons for Marian perspectives. For many, it's a little circle with Mary. The Eucharist has a chalice, remembering. Prayer is the hand. So you remember those icons, you've probably seen them in the support documents and your own teaching programs. So later on, we're suggesting or we're going to provide you with an example of a liberal arts icon that you can use in your teaching and learning programs as well. But gee, for some of you, it might be a code that you use. It might be LA, or you might colour code something. We're not mandating how you include the liberal arts in your programs at all. It's totally up to you. I'm a big believer in understanding the why. So here's just a few points for you to consider. So the Catholic liberal arts will allow students to explore concepts in depth, promote deep learning in religious education. And deep learning is being rolled out across our system currently in the curriculum, education and research team. And some of you might have been in some of that professional development already. Exposing students to Catholic liberal arts will actually help them prepare for secondary studies, particularly studies in Catholic thought. So you know how now there's currently a bit of a leap between when they finish Year 10 and when they start studies in Catholic thought. Well, then some of these teaching and learning strategies, maybe the fishbowl techniques, crowd circles, etc., some of those things will be familiar to them from the junior years. And they'll certainly have exposure to the areas of the liberal arts, for example, music, art, architecture, classical writings, and the like. Fosters analytical, critical, and creative thinking. These are things we're doing already, but the liberal arts will just help to enliven them. Oral and written communication skills, problem-solving skills. Information literacy, ethical decision-making. The ability to pose meaningful questions and to give the students self-confidence and self-understanding. And I think it's always once you've got that beautiful relationship in the classroom happening where there's that atmosphere of trust and respect where students feel comfortable in questioning and then perhaps even challenging someone respectfully about an idea and having an intellectual debate, having that confidence. I think this will really help to develop those skills or to refine them perhaps if they're already. So that's the why. Are there any questions at this stage? Happy to take a few now if you have any. Okay. So then it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce to you our facilitator for today, Dr. Peter Mudge. Peter's been teaching and writing in the fields of religious education, spiritual formation, and their links with the arts for over 42 years. Peter's is a classroom teacher. He commenced his teaching at De La Salle Brothers Schools and then went on to Macquarie University and also a range of Sydney schools. He's initiated adult religious education in the Rockhampton Diocese. He's worked across 4 other dioceses in different capacities, including Wollongong, Parramatta, Wilkenia Forbes and Broken Bay. Peter's taught many online tertiary courses on religious education and spirituality in various institutions such as ACU. Peter's written over 50 academic articles, co-authored and combined 15 books and book chapters, and presented on many occasions at workshops and conferences. Peter has devoted most of his research, academic and teaching career to the twin areas of religion, education and spirituality. His academic studies, from bachelor's courses through to a master's and doctorate, have focused on spiritual formation, scripture, and connected knowing. His recent publications include Living Spirituality, Series 1, 2 and 3, and more recently Living Religion, the 6th edition, as well as other books entitled Eternal Life Letters. So personally, I'm thrilled that Peter can be with us today, and I'm sure you will experience the great breadth and depth of knowledge that Peter will share with us today. So could you please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter?
Thanks, Anthony. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to have a little bit of quiet at the beginning of the day, I think. It's going to be busy for the rest of the day. It just struck me that the last strand we're doing, Strand C, we're sort of linking up ecumenism, interfaith and ecology, because that is a very common ecumenical theme. So that's sort of looking ahead, but this would have been a great venue for looking at that topic. I hope you turn around and look at the beautiful view. I can see it, but if you turn around, that's okay if you want to look at it as well. It's a beautiful setting. A couple of things before we start, and then I'll go into the presentation. Anthony mentioned spirituality. I'll leave some of my books up the front here. I've got some copies, but there's a strong link between these books. That's Living Spirituality 1, and then there's 2, and then there's 3. So if you can't fit everything in 3 books, there's something wrong. And Eternal Life Letters is about our 2 children, so that deals with suffering and grief and death, which is, I think, a really neglected topic. So hopefully you do that somewhere with your students or sort of build up to it. But the reason why I talk about those briefly is because spirituality is often neglected in the curriculum, and we need to give students spiritual exercises such as breathing meditation. Like imagine mindful walking around a venue like this, for example. The Jesus prayer from the Orthodox tradition, the examine. There's a whole lot of exercises, but the strength of these books, which I think is, being in schools is not in a lot of books, is it shows you how to do it. So it gives you examples of how to do these in the classroom. So if you want to have a look at that. There is also a lot of sections on the church and all the strands that you're doing. I know the strands repeat through all of the stages that you're doing, but all the topics overlap. So last time we were doing B10 on social justice, and there's a chapter on prophetic imagination, the idea of being a prophet in the church. The other reason that I'd encourage you to look at those, or at least get a set, is that it's got artworks all the way through it. So it tells you about the artwork, it gives you the background, it tells you what the students need to look at looking at that artwork. So it's got modern, abstract, Renaissance, sculpture, you name it. So by all means have a look at that. In your handouts while I'm talking about that, I know you've got the PowerPoints there. But in terms of resources, so I don't go back to it because I'll be getting onto the formal topic, you'll notice handout 1 is with that vigorous sound of the handout being opened. So if you're drifting off already, that would have woken you up. But handout number 1, I had to have an operation for a pinched nerve at one stage, so I couldn't actually type one letter. If you've had one of those pinched nerves, you can't actually move your arm, and you can't actually type on the keyboard. So I've got my wife's name there, Gwen, so she actually typed that out. So I'll thank her on your behalf. But Gwen looks at a lot of this stuff. She's teaching a lot of these topics at Mount St Benedict's at Pennant Hills. So I always get her ideas for the classroom and test her out. So these are some basic resources if you're looking for either personal resources or for the library. The general ones are up the top there. It's good to look at some resources on the Catholic liberal arts. If you have that hand in hand with handout number 2, I always include a general article on the liberal arts, so if you haven't read that one, please read it. But of course, there's lots of websites, and as I was saying to Louise earlier, we know that there's tertiary institutions that now offer degrees in the liberal arts, so this is becoming quite prominent, and I'll talk more about that later. Artworks, you'll notice the Word on Fire Bibles. If you haven't seen those, the ones with the black cover down the bottom of the resource sheet, just going back to handout 1. That has artworks explained all the way through it. So they've done the Gospels, they've done the rest of the New Testament writings, and now they've done the Pedagogy. So all the way through, Robert Barron and Word on Fire saying that the three pathways to Christianity, and indeed any religion, is beauty, truth and goodness. So they're the three pathways. That's how most of us get there. Like we go into a cathedral, we're taught about the symbols, we're taught about the truth, we're taught to live good lives. You can enter via any pathway, but it's based on that. So that has artworks all the way through it. So if you're going to get a set for the school, get that one. I put mine over the page, and it tells you what's in each one. But even basic ones, you'll see in book 2 there over on page 2, things that we can easily miss out in the curriculum, which I'm sort of, when you look at the great artworks, these things are always there. So they're the great Catholic artworks, but of course after the Reformation, there were Protestant Catholic artworks, and people of no religion or atheists or agnostics, they're all exploring values or virtues. And you can see in book 2 on page 2, the second paragraph, memento vivendi and memento mori. Remember you must live, remember you must die. Like, it's not being pessimistic to say as soon as you're born, you're heading towards your last days. You're growing, but you have to live life to the full, but remember one day you're not going to be here. So that is in all the artworks, and that's why the cross is so central to Christianity. So there's some other artworks. There's lots of, I'm a big Sister Wendy fan because she explains the artwork. And those art books where they give you 5 features of a painting. Sister Wendy's not the only one. So look at this, look at that, look at that facial, look at that symbol. So this is a type of visual literacy that we're trying to teach our students. You'll see the best of Sister Wendy. And she's got lots of letters and things that come out. On the last page, you'll see other artists like Hieronymus Bosch, who came from Den Bosch in Holland. He's a really wacky artist, but he's deserving of close attention. We'll look at one of his works today called The Peddler, because one of the key themes in church is pilgrimage. So I thought that was a good central one to look at. So there's lots of other ones. There's Latin sayings. So we're looking at the whole breadth of the arts. It's good for the students to learn some basic Latin, like some, as I said, memento mori. They will need to learn Latin when they're, at least some phrases when they're looking at some of the paintings anyway, of the Annunciation or the Incarnation. So that's a good thing. But we want to look at poetry, and I'm sure you'll come up with some good ideas today. We need to look at architecture, pilgrimage rituals, like all of these things fit into the arts. And the great works by Augustine, the great Gregorian chants and so on. So it's really a vast area. So what I'm trying to do today is to say, here are some key ones for learning experience 1, 2 and 3. Before we go in, the last thing to remember, this is called a forward hook. If you've read John Medina and Brain Rules, like this is what he's talking about, we're sort of hooking you into the future sessions. So you can do a forward hook or a backward hook, and it's sort of whetting the appetite of the students for the next topic. So what I want you to keep in mind, because it'll become incarnate or real later on, is that I want you to select an artwork or something from the artworks, and at the end of the day, as Anthony pointed out, is for you to put up a suggestion for work that we can all share across the Archdiocese. So it could be one artwork, it could be, we'll look at Geoffrey Chaucer and pilgrimage, it could be a text from the Canterbury Tales, but pick something and link it to the Catholic teaching in order to go deep, as Anthony was saying, and link it up with a learning experience 1, 2 or 3. So it's not a big task, but something will catch your attention, or you will have a better idea. Remember one of the teachers from the last in-service, who was Indigenous herself, she picked Indigenous graffiti and looked at themes from social justice for E10. So there's lots of creative ways. There's modern classics and there's ancient classics. So we're going to talk about some of those topics now, but just keep in mind, if something catches your attention, start looking at that. Maybe you can build up some ideas as we're going along. Okay. Now, alertness test to start the day, because I know you're really fresh when you start the day. You're probably some of you still waking up, or depends if you're an owl person or a sparrow person or whatever, but we've got the wrong heading on the first slide. That was my mistake, it's not really a test. So I've still got E10, but I've corrected that in the final version. So on your notes, you've got the wrong slide. So if you're really keen, you want to take a picture of the real slide, you can do that now. But it'll be in the proper version up on the screen there.
Peter, can I just jump in? Everything today is going to be shared with you electronically in a folder. So the PowerPoints, the handouts, etc. Just for practical reasons, we've printed some for you to flip through. But rest assured, you'll get an electronic copy before you leave.
And you'll, these will be among your best friends after you finish today. You'll get to know them. So if you've got a good idea on the classics or the arts and how to teach it, please say something. Because I know there's a lot of ideas when we wander around, but sometimes people don't say, oh, I've got this great idea, so please share it. Okay, so we'll look at an introduction. CLA is Catholic Liberal Arts. For those of you who've been to previous days, I can see a few of you. I've got a few different things in here as we've built the presentation. But I remember studying theology, I was looking at different terms, and it took me 3 or 4 lectures to actually get it after I listened to different lecturers. So I think it's good if it washes over you or you get new insights on it. Okay, so we know what the topic is. I've put that illustration on the front there just to say that we're looking at a huge breadth of art. We tend to focus on Europe, which is 20,000 BCE basically, but really our own indigenous culture goes back as far as 60,000, probably further. For example, there's ritual sites that are underwater that we still haven't looked at because the seas rose twice, as you probably know. So we probably need some underwater archaeologists to look at dating and campfires that are under the ocean. I would suggest it goes back further. But if you're looking at cave paintings, you might look at sites and say, well, that's not really old. I mean, it's pretty old, it's thousands of years. But really the test of Aboriginal art is they're looking at the remains of ochre that was used on the caves. So there's a sample in the National Museum in Canberra, and that goes back to about 65,000 years. So these are the rocks that they ground the ochre with to put in the cave painting. So that gives you an idea of why the years are being added. So that whole tradition of art that goes back to Paleolithic times and back to early Indigenous times, that's part of the whole expanse we're looking at. So you could base a teaching experience on an artwork to do with community and then link that with church, for example, today. So the first one is that we're looking at a different way of teaching, and I'll talk about other pedagogical things along the way. But the first thing is that some of you will be used to this idea of visual literacy. We're starting from a different perspective. We're not starting with the notes. I'm starting with a few slides here, so I'm actually teaching you the wrong way. But when I get to the artworks, I'll be starting with the image. So the image or the visual literacy is the first thing that you need to start with. Not a whole lot of explanations. You give minimal information on the artwork and then get students to look at the artwork. So for example, later on we'll be looking at Leonardo da Vinci, Salvator Mundi, which is his image of Christ. So you would get them to look at that. You would say, this is by so-and-so, it's this year, and then look at it. Don't give them, 10 pages of notes. So this idea of visual literacy, of learning through the visual, is really important. And also, as Ken Robinson said, the way of teaching used to be, I've got an idea in my head, I'm the teacher. You've got to guess it. That's the trick of the classroom, and it'll be on the test. We can't teach that way anymore, obviously. Obviously, we're transferring some knowledge. But when you look at an artwork, it's polyvalent, it's capable of 20 interpretations. So, and that is exciting for teachers and also for students, I think. We'll also be looking at the liberal arts. What are they? We have to select a certain number. When I'm developing this day, I might look at 30 examples, and I think I can only include 2 or 3. But I'm trying to pick the best and to save you time as well. The pedagogical focus, I've already mentioned visual literacy. I'll mention some of these things so I can go through it quickly as well. Christianity and art is a language of paradox. So it can be one thing and both things at the same time. So, for example, the way of Jesus in the Gospels, it's a difficult way. It's the way of the cross. And yet Jesus says, my way is easy and my burden is light. They're both true. So this idea of paradox, there's just not one explanation. If you come up with one explanation for an artwork, you're off the track because there's multiple interpretations. So yes, look at what the artist intended in the artwork, but then you've got your own interpretation. If someone says that artwork makes me sad, say it's a Rothko artwork, and it reminds me of a time of grieving or something, well, that's legitimate, that's their reaction. But they still need to know about why Rothko painted that artwork. So they're both important. Rhizomatic knowing, you can look up if you want to know about it, but I'll be going into that a bit. People in previous in-services wouldn't have looked at that. So I'm going to talk about a contrast between arboreal knowing, which is going through a tree structure with branches, and rhizomatic knowing, which means roots that spread along the ground in any direction. So that's a pedagogy that fits well with the liberal arts. We'll also give you a few teaching strategies. You might be using these already, but speech bubbles, block out poetry. And what I've tried to do, I think we've gradually improved these, I think. We've, just talking to Anthony and Kathy and Genevieve and Andy. We've sort of improved these. We've looked at the feedback. And what I've tried to do is to take an artwork and put all the theology and spirituality with the artwork and the background so it's all together, so you can see it, but a bit of an introduction is necessary. I hope you don't feel like The Clown of God. That's a children's book where a vagabond is trying to keep all these balls in the air at the same time. So the golden ball there is the Catholic liberal arts. That's the main one to keep your eyes on in terms of today. That's my website if you want to look at any of those details on the books. There's you'll see a menu for articles up the top there. There's lots of free articles on spirituality for teachers, so if you want to look at that site later. I think that saying by Paula D'Arcy up the top, God comes to you disguised as your life, is particularly true of us, and it's true of the liberal arts. So Kierkegaard has another saying, life is lived forwards but understood backwards. So you can see the role of God in your life when you look backwards, not always while you're living it. Okay, so the handouts, we've looked at 1 and 2. I just draw your attention to the last one at the back of the pack, number 9. For those of you that haven't seen it, this was an excellent article about a psychologist who came to understand Renaissance art, who knew nothing about churches. I think this is good for teachers. It's just a 2-page article, so this is number 9. It's got Strand B10 up the top, but really this is relevant to all the strands, so don't worry about that. And I've just highlighted some key words in that article, and you can see these are some of the themes that will come through today. So really this is a story of a psychologist who was sort of sceptical about churches and the arts. And the arts, through those 3 pathways, you remember, truth, beauty and goodness, drew her in. So it's actually, I think, Year 10s would get something out of that article as well. So the arts are always connected with a narrative. It's not just information or facts. Like, it's the story of that psychologist, that female psychologist. It's the story of Leonardo da Vinci. It's the story of Hieronymus Bosch. So the stories of the artists are also interesting, and that gives meaning to the artwork. Right, I've just You can see I'm starting to lead with images, so we'll go totally into images. So one of the other pedagogical lenses, if you like, for today is digging deeper. And Anthony mentioned that word a couple of times in his background to the CLA. So really a number of reports, like not just Gonski, but right back, have, and it hasn't happened a lot, but we've got permission to dig deeper and go more deeply into artworks. So what I'm saying today is don't look at 10 aspects of the Catholic liberal arts, like poetry, architecture, and so on, and just skim across them. Pick a couple and go deeper. And if necessary, connect them with other artworks after that. But you know what I mean? You're going to that one, and then you're going to that one, and they're sort of like separate silos. No, just pick 2 or 3 and go a bit deeper. So that is an important approach, and that's why we're looking at, one example or one linked example. So, for example, you could look at a Leonardo da Vinci, which might link up with poetry, which might link up with something about his life, which might link up with literature or architecture or a story about Leonardo. So you've got it all together. So this is connected knowing. So visual literacy we've talked about as one of the pedagogies. You can't talk about art without linking it up with theology and spirituality and pedagogy. So once again, that question I'll keep coming back to, and I don't apologise for repeating it. What image will you choose to share? Like, what is the image that you'll focus on that you think would be a good one for your students? So, I'm not someone who reads out all the words on a slide, so don't worry. I'm just talking about the general idea, and you've got the notes. But it was interesting, that interview with David D. Cavallo, who has been concerned with the national curriculum, CEO of ACARA. So he was talking to Geraldine Dugan saying, we need to declutter the curriculum. Past school programs went a mile wide and an inch deep. Now we need to change course and go deeper rather than wider. So I think you as teachers need to talk to your RECs, your heads of mission, the executive. I'm sure a lot of them have got this vision already, but to say this is the way we need to teach. Yes, we've got a curriculum or a syllabus, but a program is where you choose the elements that you want to emphasise. What will all the students do for a formal assessment task? What extension students can go in this direction if they want, but you need to choose and you need to have enough time to teach it. So we know from the recent surveys on teachers that they haven't got time to do the teaching. So we need to pick those limited examples and go deeper. As Jesus says in Luke chapter 6, whoever listens to my words and acts on them, that one is like a person building a house who dug deeply and laid the foundation on rock. So Jesus is actually criticising. He wasn't thinking about the Catholic liberal arts and our in service today, but the idea behind it is that it's not the person who builds on sand, it's the one who digs deeply into the rock. And that could be applied to pedagogy. Your focus is contemplation and the cultivation of wisdom and praxis. So it's looking at an artwork and saying, how does that challenge us to live our lives? What virtues does it propose? How is it challenging us? Okay, so what do we mean by the liberal arts? So I'll just do an overview and then take any questions. So just write things down if they aren't clear. But as I said, it needs to wash over you quite a bit. I'll keep an eye on the timetable as well. Must want to remind me we've got 10 minutes to go as usual, Anthony. Okay, so yeah, we're going well. So the 7 liberal arts. So it was a combination of a quadrivium, which is 4, and a trivium, which is 3. So we started with astronomy, and don't forget, like that is a form of the liberal arts, like the constellations. The 7 sisters in the sky is the Aboriginal legend of the Pleiades, the sisters. So you can teach a lot through the Greek myths that are in the stars, the Greek and the Roman myths, and also through astronomy and the dark emu, which is, that dark shape inside the Milky Way. So if you haven't heard of that, astronomy used to be part of a general education and a deep education for those in the Middle Ages. And they also looked at the zodiac. So if you go inside, I've been lucky to go to Milan Cathedral, they've got the zodiac on the floor of the cathedral inside. Like, it's not a pagan symbol. It was part of their learning of the day. And they've got the light of Christ hitting the zodiac and then reflecting in different places. So they had to learn about plants, they had to learn about literature, they had to learn about oratory, and as we mentioned before, critical reasoning. And we added to that the trivium, rhetoric, grammar and dialectic. And I think we can still see that in terms of the students explaining their artworks and explaining their approach. And I always remember I had a composite year 5-6 class, and the students there, I shared this with some of the primary colleagues, they got poor scores on literacy and numeracy, but they were fantastic at philosophy because no one had ever asked them. They were the ones staring out the window. But when they interpreted artworks, I could see the teachers' jaws drop. They couldn't believe what these kids were saying. So we've got to give them the opportunity to look at these areas. The word liberal arts, the word liberalis means worthy of a free person. So that idea of the arts giving you a fullness of being and freeing you as a person. So the liberal arts helps to make you a free person. Some of you might have studied Paulo Freire on emancipatory praxis and the Brazilian educator, and he basically said the whole idea of education is to free that person to become most fully who they are. So I'm sure in your mission statements for the schools, you've got things like, we want to develop the full potential of the person, those sort of phrases. That's where it comes from. So there's a couple of Greek words. Eudaimonia means educating a person to his or her full potential. So that's a really important word. So when you remember Jesus, I've come so that you may have life and have it to the full. We know that one, John 10:10. And then the second Greek word, I don't think there's any others I'll talk about, but anyway, if there are, just ignore it. Epiktasis means stretching. So the idea is to stretch you to your full potential. And if you look at the word education in a dictionary, and a lot of people when they're trying to look at words, they don't look at dictionaries because the root word is there. Education comes from educere, which means to lead you to a new way of seeing. To literally lead them to a new country, to a new way of looking and being. So what we're trying to do is to stretch them to a new reality. So what's the point of education if we're just reinforcing what the students already know? Okay, start from what they know and then stretch them. They're on one mountain range, show them the other 3 mountain ranges behind that. That's the idea of education. Okay, there were other emphases added throughout the ages on philosophy and poetry. So these are the topics. We've had to limit ourselves to a couple. These are the ones we'll keep coming back to. Don't forget that creation is made in the image and likeness of God. So if you like, we're not just talking about text. This is the limit of text-based education, not just text, but creation around here is a text. It was the first text of God. God is imprinted in education. So if I'm thinking of the great Franciscan Bonaventure, who was alive at the same time as Aquinas, and he said the footprints or the fingerprints of God are in everything that we see. So it's like God, imagine God walking in the Garden of Eden out there, which is what it's like. So the footprints of God, God is showing you God's self through all those things out there, all the animals. The cosmos, of course. So we include science here, space exploration, all those topics there. History, architecture. Why is architecture so good? Because as we'll see from Canterbury Cathedral, you go inside and all the artworks and all the history are inside. The grave of St Thomas Becket is inside Canterbury Cathedral. I think that's right. That's where he was martyred. But there's all the artworks, there's all the relics, there's all the sanctuaries, there's all the paintings. So you could actually look at Canterbury Cathedral and you could cover a lot of these areas. You could cover poetry in the Canterbury Tales, so I'll show you some of that. Classical writing and fragments. One of the things I'll come back to is that you don't have to go through the whole writings of St. Augustine. Like, that's about that thick, on the Trinity or the City of God or whatever. Just give them a fragment, right? So it's important just to give them a taste, and if they want to go further, then they can take that further. So that's the theology of the fragment. The theology behind that is that we only see God in fragments. Remember, it says in the Bible, or if you remember Raiders of the Lost Ark, if you see God, you die, because the fullness of being just wipes out you as a lesser being. So we only see fragments of God, or we see a revelation in a bird or nature or a person or literature, and then it disappears because it would be too much for us. So it's okay to give students fragments, like just a little taste. I think there was a book actually called Atomic Habits. You might want to look that up. And that does the same thing. It says, just give them a small experience of something. Forget who it's by, but you can look that up, Atomic Habits. And it basically says, instead of doing 20 minutes of mindful walking or breathing meditation, just give them one experience. For example, I'm on about praxis, so just put your pens down for a minute. And just get into a comfortable position. Don't worry, we're not wasting much time. It's all right. You'll be rewarded by this experience. And just close your eyes. And a basic approach to breathing meditation is just to calm the body. So just breathe in, usually through the nose and out through the mouth. Or all the way through the nose if you're a nose breather. And what I want you to do is to do deep breathing. So if you breathe in, I want you to push your tummy out so the air fills up. And then to hold that for 5 if you can, and then to breathe out. So try that again. And then pull the stomach back in so it forces the air out. Don't contort yourself or do any damage, just do it gently. So this is diaphragmatic breathing, so breathe in through the nose, push the tummy out. Count for 5, which is a good amount for most people, and then just do that one more time. And then I want you to imagine breathing in light and breathing out darkness. So however you imagine that to be, breathe in light and breathe out darkness. You have to use your imagination. Breathe in light and breathe out darkness. Just do that 2 or 3 times. And just as a last exercise, breathe in a quality that you would like, whether it's service or humility or love or hope, it could be anything. And then breathe out a quality that you would like to get rid of, whether it's gossip or anger. It could be materialism, consumerism. So breathe in the desired quality and breathe out the one that you'd like to get rid of with God's grace. Okay, and when you're ready, just open your eyes gently. So that's an example of an atomic habit. It takes less than 5 minutes. And that's a basic breathing meditation exercise. And you can see you could build on words in scripture text, or you could build on words from poetry, anything that goes in, anything that goes out. So that book, Atomic Habits, is worth looking up. So spiritual classics, philosophy, theology. And it says in the middle there, we have this propensity to split things into silos. So, we split off scripture from liturgy. We split off theology and philosophy and RE. Even some of the universities did it. They put them in different departments. They all belong together. Right, so if you pick a good example, this is the test, a lot of those areas will gravitate towards that artwork or that text, whatever you pick. Okay, so I mentioned there again, drilling deep. Okay, we talked about pedagogy. This is my only insight, but I think it's a good one. How many have heard of rhizomatic approaches? It really came through technology. So rhizomatic means a root system that spreads. So if you've got mint in your garden, that's a rhizomatic plant. And you can see, you can't stop it. Like you try and chop into it and it just goes underground and it comes up. It's not the same as spitting seeds from a plant like a nasturtium or something like that, but it's something where the roots, any one root, can become a new plant. So the reason why that started as a technical term in technology is because it applies to the internet. That's the way the internet spreads randomly. And I think this fits perfectly with the Catholic liberal arts. I'll just call it CLA. So this root system, you can see it's spreading and a new plant starting to the right there. And you probably know plants like that. And you'll see a root system like that in rhizomatic. So this is contrasted with arboreal, which is tree shape, which you can see out there. I'd love to be able to fit examples of that in the room there, but I think you can sort of imagine. So we're talking about pedagogy and education. So arboreal is tree shape with a set pattern, good for order and certainty, hard to change, normally teacher-centred. So normally if you think of a tree, you go up the trunk, you go along that branch, you have to go along the branches in order, you go along that branch, that could be English, science, you go up to the next one. It's like some of the old style libraries are designed, everything's in a certain section. But a lot of books today that are crossing over between cosmology and poetry and philosophy, where do you put them? You can't put them in one section. They're rhizomatic texts. So rhizomatic, knowledge and wisdom can emerge from any node. You can go in any direction. That's a bit scary if you're a teacher. Any connection or source. So I've said the internet, random multiple directions to find knowledge, excellent for teaching, CLA. Students pursue their own research direction. So what I suggest is I'm not talking about abandoning arboreal pedagogy. We need that for a bit of order and a bit of discipline. So you might start in an arboreal way when you're teaching. You might have a common assessment task where there's a lot of student direction. And then for those students, you can allow them to be rhizomatic and say, okay, let's have a common assessment task on the church. Let's look at this image of the pilgrim. I mentioned Bosch before, which we'll see soon. Let's all look at that. And then I'll allow you to pick 3 other examples and we'll make a common assessment task and we can have the same marking criteria. So it's not hard to do. So you can allow those students who are capable to go in their own research directions and you can give guidance to other students and you can give them a common task so that you can see how they're all going by way of comparison. So a bit of a comparison, the arboreal, a single structure. It usually works in straight lines, so you can't skip from branch to branch like a monkey. One-dimensional, predictable. And you can think of education systems that are like that. Like when I was educated about church history, we did it in chronological order. We started it this year. There was no comparison. We just went right through, which has advantages. You can see where people fit, but it's not the be-all and end-all of good education. So we went chronologically from the beginning of the church right through to Vatican II. And I can remember a lot of that, but I was unable to make comparisons or also to trace patterns through that history, which is what we want the students to do. It's hierarchical and closed, more open to powerful insiders who can control it. Consolidates patterns that are already there, no new patterns. The rhizomatic one, you can see the roots spreading. And this, by the way, that's the way our students think as well. Like, as I said to some of you beforehand, if they're looking at a new device, they're not going to read the how-to manual, and probably, I'm looking at the age of some of you, you would do the same. You would just play with it and see where the different menus and the different things go. What direction, what's under that. And that's the way the internet works, is trying to pull you in all these directions, usually to buy things. So you can see the comparison, different points of equal growth across a lateral path, multiple and divergent lines, so it's polyvalent, it's polydirectional. Many directions you've got to choose, many different meanings that you could get from it. So what I'm saying is the internet and the liberal arts, when we look at the paintings, is like this. So it's a different type of pedagogy. I've mentioned visual literacy, and now I'm mentioning rhizomatic. That's two ways in which it's different. And you might already teach in that way. I think some of you do from talking to you, but it could be a new approach. So once again, start with little steps. Like you don't have to say, oh, I've got to do every single art image that Peter talked about. No, just pick one, right? You don't have to know everything about the topic. Let the kids do the research on Leonardo da Vinci or whatever, or the Canterbury Tales. Okay. So I think the trick with arboreal and rhizomatic is that you need to have your comfort zone and your control in the classroom, but allow the students to explore different areas. So it's really a question, how do you do it? But there's two different ways of doing it. Okay, so an example of arboreal processing, it will be mainly text-based. In terms of the church unit B10, every student studies the same materials for learning experience 1 on the Pilgrim Church. So it might be a text from Vatican II, it's normally text-based. Students study via handouts and online websites, which are limited and prescribed. Quotations from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So I'm looking at an arid version of arboreal. But you have a lot more room to move in the rhizomatic processing. So mainly image-based, visual literacy. You can go across poetry, science, art, architecture, music. The other thing is with the arboreal, there's normally one interpretation, which is approved by the teacher. In rhizomatic, there's multiple interpretations which are valid. And of course, the reasoning comes in where the student has to justify their interpretation of that painting or that artwork. They can all start with the same node. So I've told you before with Bosch, it's a town that is in Holland, Sir Herten Bosch. So he was someone from Bosch, the Peddler or the Wayfarer. He was so famous in the north and in Spain that most of his paintings are not in Holland. They're in the Prado in Madrid and these other places. So unfortunately, you can't see many of his paintings there. Then you would have a choice after looking at the Peddler or the Wayfarer as a common task to look at texts on pilgrimage, maps of pilgrimages, music or poetry, virtual pilgrimage, and so on. Informal assessment is the same. You could have a formal assessment task, but you'd have multiple directions or multiple choices. Okay, so that's Bosch. We'll look at that in more detail. That's called the Peddler or the Wayfarer. And once again, it just looks like a fairly ordinary painting, but it's highly symbolic and there's all these meanings built into it. So this idea of pilgrimage is really important. This is how I often use cartoons. I've used a few in this presentation. So you can see all the different creatures there, and you might think of those in terms of your students. You've probably seen this cartoon before. So the teacher says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. So it's interesting that fits in with the arboreal approach, which is a tree-centred approach. So the rhizomatic approach would be offering them more opportunities for learning. So you can see the only one who's happy is the monkey. So you've got to climb the tree. You can't fly up to it. So they're all stuck, especially the fish. So you could probably put names beside some of the students who are different there and giving them options. But, you know, how well a student can learn and show you what they can do is proportional to the opportunities you give them in the classroom. And you might be surprised by how they approach art. Okay, any questions? That's a new section. Is that making sense, the distinction between arboreal and rhizomatic? So if you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to do a bit of reading on that, because there's just websites that explain it and give examples, but it'd be good for you to read it and say, well, this is how I would do arboreal in the classroom or rhizomatic in the classroom. And watch the students' responses when you give them a greater variety of tasks. You've probably already seen that. Okay, let's talk about a classic, which is the second area. And this lays the foundation before we go to the learning experiences. So there's a whole lot of definitions here. Once again, a good test of reason and critique is if you don't just look at one side or one definition, you look across and look for the common elements. So that's what you want your students to do. Some students will be capable of less and some will be capable of more. But if I think some educators talk about the parable of the talents. You're given certain talents and you've got to use those depending on your capacity. And Aquinas says that, grace is given to people depending on their capacity to receive it. So students will all have different capacities and they can do things inside the school and they can probably do more things outside the school, the formal curriculum. So a classic is a work judged over a period of time to be of the highest quality and outstanding of its kind. A work of art of recognised and established value, a work of enduring excellence. I suppose the question is who sets the values and who sets the criteria, which is a good question. An authoritative source, where does the authority come from? So it was originally belonging to a certain class. Now we can apply this to, this is a slide we've used, so we apply this to B10. What we've come up with, and the teachers have come up with some of these insights as we've gone along and discussed it, there seem to be different types of classics. So it's not just a cave painting, an Aboriginal cave painting from Arnhem Land. There can be some very ancient classics. There can be some medieval classics, and there can be some modern classics. And sometimes they build on each other. So, for example, some of you might know the Aboriginal art from Papunya Tula, which is who was a Geoffrey Barton taught the Aboriginal elders to paint. That's where the early Aboriginal art came from, I think, west of Alice Springs out that way. So they produced that as modern art, but it was based on ancient symbols and ancient dreaming paths. And don't forget, dreaming paths for Aboriginal people go through the sky, they go through the land, they go through the oceans. The ancestors are on dreaming paths. The rainbow serpent is on a dreaming path underneath the land, underneath country. So, is that a modern work? Yes, it was done in a modern period, but it's based on ancient symbols that were passed on in an oral tradition. So you can't say it's just a modern one, it's actually ancient and modern. So some of these are tricky to classify. What you might think about is combining an ancient or medieval one with a modern one. So say, for example, I was just talking to Russell before, Les from the Cathedral School, combined the works of mercy, the 7 works of mercy. One of them is burying the dead. So this was a 15th century artwork, and he combined that with some verses from Eleanor Rigby by the Beatles. So that's an example of the modern and the medieval going together. The reason is there's actually 3 periods. The Dutch people actually took the works of mercy, and then they worked out there were certain homeless people who had died. So they were the burial people for the homeless. So what they did is they collected their story from the community, because they had to give a eulogy. They make sure that everyone had a story about themselves because this person was homeless. So the verse, I think you remember from Eleanor Rigby, if you know the Beatles, buried along without any money or without any name or something like that. So this is like the homeless burial society. So he linked up those two. So he's linking up 3 different classics. So this is the sort of thing that I want you to think about. Like an artwork will link with something else in your teaching, and the students can help you make the associations. Right, a classic is multivalent. It continually gets interpreted. So the Gospels is a good example. St. Augustine's Confessions, a whole lot of poems that we can think of. Are there classics within classics? Yes, The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien has taken a whole lot of ancient Anglo-Saxon and other sagas and put them into The Lord of the Rings and sort of updated them. And don't forget, he actually read that to a group that included C.S. Lewis, and they shared their stories and tested out the stories with each other. So they're ancient stories put into a modern novel or trilogy or whatever. The reworkings of Shakespeare, and we know all the different ones. They're not of equal quality, but there's films and there's writings about Jesus, there's gospels and so on. What are the formative questions you are raising for the students? Not information, but formation. As one of the aphorisms, or aphorism is a pithy saying, a short saying, they will envy you for your success, wealth, intelligence, looks and status, but rarely for your wisdom. So we're trying to cultivate wisdom here that goes with the arts. Are there still classics in light of today's cancel culture? So have we got the right to make decisions and cancel things when we don't know where they came from, or we're making decisions for our generation and future generations? That's a good discussion point. The example I gave last time was that there was a plaque to an early settler out at Windsor. Anyone come from Windsor here? Good, I can tell that story. So there's a square out at Windsor who was a very highly regarded colonist. He saved people from floods, but he was also involved in an Aboriginal massacre at Yarramundi. And one of the squares in Windsor is named after this person. So what do you do? Get rid of that? Do you put a plaque that has both stories? This person did this but was involved in this. If it's so bad, do you get rid of it? And who makes the decision? So I think that's a great discussion point for students, because we're saying this is a classic or this is worthwhile. This should be kept as part of our culture. So I think that's a really interesting. We go to handout number 3. So this is just a bit of background, just a couple of sources that will help you think about what is a classic. So you might have discussions on staff. It would be good to get your staff together and say, what are the classical images and text that we're going to look at? And don't forget, text includes, as I said, images, but it includes creation. The classical text with God's fingerprints includes everything, includes the cosmos. So that handout there, I've put a couple of the criteria, but as I say for all these presentations, everything is contested. Everything is criticised or critiqued. And we want the students to have the information, but then when they've got the information, they might disagree with us. You've probably encountered that in the classroom. Has anyone got a classroom where all the students agree with them? No. So you're informing them and educating them, and they might look at all the information and say, I don't agree with you. I think this is that's good. It's a philosophical discussion. But ask them to give a reason for their opinion. And part of philosophy is if you change your mind, which you hope they do, give a reason for why they've changed their mind. That's philosophical thinking. You can pick them up and read them or reread them at any time. There's not many books that I reread, but there's a few. The influence they exert in our imagination is unforgettable. We think we've read it before. It's never exhausted, and so on. So a couple of quotes from Italo Calvino, Italian writer, famous writer. A classic is a work which retains a consciousness of its own modernity or relevance without ceasing to be aware of other classic works of the past. We stand on the shoulders of giants, both literary, visual, architectural, and so on. So it's worth having a discussion instead of saying, I've got all the examples for you. Perhaps you can choose some examples for a Strand, and the students can help choose some other examples. So you want to train them in the process of discernment and critical reasoning. So, okay, we've talked about the Catholic liberal arts. You can give them a quick overview of that. We've talked about classics, because I think they need to have that conversation. Now, which examples do you think are best for this strand or this unit? There we go. And just a few slides before we go to learning experience 1. Why are the arts important? Some of you might be asking that. I've given you a few quotes from John Paul II, so if you want some further reading, Pope John Paul II has written a letter to artists, and that is something you probably should have in your online bank of documents. They create epiphanies of beauty. The arts help us to link the good, the truthful and the beautiful. So a lot of people use that example of Chartres Cathedral or some other church, or St Mary's Cathedral that they've been into, an Orthodox church. There's a couple of new mosques that have just been built as well. Like the beauty, the truth and the goodness is there. So in the cathedral or the mosque, it might have the names of God in various places. Or I think it's the 99 beautiful names of God in Islam. So this is an attempt to draw you into the truth, beauty and goodness that you want to explore. The most beautiful face in the Christian tradition is the face of Christ. So that raises the idea of a person is beautiful through the life that they've led, through their teaching, through their care for the poor. I've just been writing some articles for the Josephites on their spirituality. One was 40 pages long, so it had footnotes, and they wanted to know what would their spirituality look like in the future. Is anyone from a Josephite school? No. Oh, there we go. Someone from Josephite school. So the congregation rang me up and said, looking at spirituality, what do you think Josephite spirituality might look like, or would it need to look at in the next 10 or 20 years? So 40 pages later, and reading about Mary MacKillop and Julian Tennyson Woods. And I thought, I can have a rest now. Then I got a call from Edmund Rice Australia, the Christian Brothers. So now I'm reading up on Edmund Rice, and I'm doing the same thing. So that's great. There's a lot of interest in, like, how should we transmit our spirituality? Quite similar lives, actually, if you look at them. And as Anthony said to me before, many religious orders are like that. So the beautiful face of Christ, or the beautiful actions, him as a beautiful person. I know that word has been cheapened. You know, she was just a beautiful person, but we're talking about something deeper here. Like the beauty of their life, the beauty of their ethics, dying for the sake of others, the whole thing of the cross. I'll just read this one. The way of beauty is called the Via Pulchritudinis. Benedict says in 2011, it may have happened that you paused before a sculpture, a picture, might say a poem, piece of music, that you found deeply moving. And you might remember that time. Did you pause before something that stopped you in your tracks? Like, was it a sculpture? Was it a painting? That you found deeply moving and gave you a sense of joy, a clear perception, that is, that what you beheld was not only matter, a painted canvas, a collection of letters or an accumulation of sounds, but something greater, something that speaks, that can touch the heart, communicate a message, uplift the mind. So that's what we're talking about, being struck. And you want to try and show that to your students. And if the students just, it's a community of learners, don't let them just, dismiss things. You find something that makes you stop in your tracks as a work of art that maybe is shared with others in the class, because it can't be an individual thing. And don't forget that thing of something that speaks and something that has an image behind it, has a deeper reality. We're also talking about the holy icons in the Orthodox tradition. So the idea of the icon is that you see the image of Christ, but the real Christ is behind the icon. So there's a whole spirituality to icons. So is it giving you a deeper perception? Like the cosmic Christ is behind that Christ, but this is an image to bring you back. I think finally from Francis, all those people are called to shine beauty, especially where darkness or grey dominates everyday life. I suppose the other thing about the Catholic liberal arts, Bishop Barron talks about beige Christianity. It's like a nothing Christianity that doesn't challenge anything. If you get into the Catholic liberal arts, that will challenge the way you think and the way you live if you choose a good example. I'll just let you read the headings for that. So we want to just get onto an image before we get to past. Why do you need to study and appreciate the Catholic liberal arts? It's our heritage. So if someone is, do I really need to teach this stuff? This is the way that everyone was educated in faith and reason philosophy for generations before ours. We've sort of lost it in the last 2 or 3 generations. So for example, mainly people who are wealthy, but when people got educated, everyone got this. They did tours of Europe and went to the great Greek and Roman sculptures and paintings. That was part of a broad education. So we're bringing this to it's a non-negotiable. And all these people who were educated in the liberal arts, if they weren't educated, we wouldn't have them. So we're talking about some of those people. Cicero, Plato, Dante, Aquinas. Like, we rely on their insights and wisdom today. Otherwise we wouldn't have them. Thomas Merton. It cultivates genuine freedom. So it's freedom not to do whatever you want, but it's freedom for other people. It helps develop a sound combination of faith and reason. It's to make a life, not just a living. So you're actually living a meaningful life, not just getting a wage and being a cog in the machine. It helps students engage with some of the most important issues of today. So this quote from Apple co-founder Steve Jobs says, "It's in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with the liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields us the results that make our hearts sing." I think that's a great quote. So we want the heart to sing. We don't just want the mind. We want the mind, the heart and the hands to work together. So this is praxis pedagogy. You know, you're teaching something. How do I respond? So, you know, the rich young man in the Gospels, I've got all this wealth, and Jesus says, now you need to sell everything you own and follow me. No, I can't do it. A lot of people can't come along, but it has to be praxis. If you look at all the great saints, they're saints of praxis, you know. Francis, Catherine of Siena, Thomas Merton, and so on. There's just a slide there on where we lost the liberal arts. That's a few quotes there from some documents. But it was actually, you know, part of a classical education. So it's not just about being useful for jobs, it's being broadened as a person of wisdom. It's not just being able to, you know, work on a machine or work in technology. Yes, that's good. But this is the full development of the person. I mentioned before, eudaimonia, epiktasis. Okay, and finally, before we go on, we'll take a few questions if there's some. Everything is connected and we require multiple maps. So I want to leave you with 2 metaphors. One's from C.S. Lewis, wrote The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, and the other one's from Mary Midgley, who's a philosopher. So in terms of our tradition, the fact is we've lost a lot of traditions. We pick and choose the traditions. It's so vast, like 2,000 years and then going back to Genesis, thousands of years. So C.S. Lewis has this train metaphor for tradition. Humanity does not pass through phases as a train passes through stations. Being alive, it has the privilege of always moving yet never leaving anything behind. Whatever we have been, in some sort, we are still. So in other words, we forget about some of the carriages on the train. They get all dusty, but they're still all connected to the train. We just haven't been there. So a lot of these artworks are like train carriages that we'll look at today. So we're not leaving off the carriages and then blowing them up and then making new ones. And Mary Midgley says we need multiple overlapping maps. So we don't just need science, we don't just need literature, we need them all. They're overlapping. Science and theology represent different perspectives on our complex world, like walking around a mountain and viewing it from different angles. So Buddhism says you see the mountain disappears, and then you see the mountain again. You've only seen that face of the mountain. You haven't walked around it. Oh, that's the mountain, that looks different. Oh, that side looks different. So it's like the diamond with the different faces. The philosopher Mary Mitchell invites us to think of using multiple maps to do justice to the complexity of science and theology. Different maps provide different information. So just a commentary from me, we need multiple maps that overlap one another and combine their unique information sets. Think of the CLA disciplines of art, architecture, poetry, maths, and so on. Medieval prints, illuminations, icons, you could add lots of them, but you have to choose. So all those areas, and it's not just one, as I'll show you with one of the paintings, it combines science and mathematics. It's not just a painting. Because the artists were also great scientists. They were looking at optics, for example. Oh, just the last one. An example of artists who have died young. You might be interested in this. So some in the Renaissance and modern who died in their 20s and 30s, a lot of them had short lives. So what they produced was just amazing. Classical composers and modern musicians. The last thing I'd say is with those maps, and we'll get to this in Learning Experience 1, theology is so important because it is the glue that holds everything together. So really theology and philosophy. So you can have music, you can have poetry, you can have architecture, but actually the words about God, who God is what holds it all together. So theology and philosophy is the glue. Philosophy is called the handmaid of theology. Right, so that's, if you're saying, oh no, we don't need theology, yes you do. And spirituality is often neglected. Spirituality is how you practice it. So that's important for praxis. So what do? Spirituality, ethics is the way I live my life. Okay, we might just take some questions and I'll show you the first image to think about during morning tea. Yeah, we've got 5 minutes and we have a break, so thanks for holding on in more ways than one. Any questions? Because we've gone through, some of you have been through that before, but in terms of the Catholic liberal arts, there's a couple of metaphors there. Visual literacy, rhizomatic and arboreal knowing. So these are the sort of tools that we're using to look at the liberal arts. If you haven't got a pedagogy, there's lots of great pedagogies around. As I said, you could use Frere, emancipatory praxis. You could use multiple intelligences. There's all sorts of things you can use. But it has to help you to teach the Catholic liberal arts. And then we looked at the different arts and then the classics and a few other things.